Most people think they know their retirement number. They've heard a figure somewhere. Maybe from a coworker, maybe from an article they skimmed once and never looked at again, and they've quietly accepted it as fact. But here's the strange part. That number is often wrong. Not slightly wrong, sometimes off by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So why does this keep happening? Why do two different retirement calculators, fed similar information, spit out completely different answers? Why does one source say you need $500,000, while another says you need $3 million? Stay with me here because the number you're about to understand could completely change the way you think about your future. A single misunderstanding about retirement costs, the kind almost nobody catches early, can quietly create a massive gap decades from now. And by the time most people notice it, there isn't much time left to fix it. By the end of this video, you'll understand how retirement numbers are actually calculated. You'll see the hidden factors that quietly push the real cost of retirement far higher than most people expect. And you'll walk away with a framework that explains why just save $1 million was never good advice in the first place. Before we go further, here's a question worth sitting with. What number do you think someone actually needs to retire comfortably today? Drop your guess in the comments right now, before you hear anything else. Later in this video, we're going to compare that number against some surprising calculations. And the gap might be much bigger than you expect. Let's start with why retirement numbers sound so wildly different depending on where you look. Search, "How much do I need to retire?" and you'll find answers ranging from a few $100,000 to well over $3 million. That's not a small disagreement. That's a difference that could mean working an extra decade or retiring years early. Here's the thing almost nobody explains clearly. There is no universal retirement number. There never was. Retirement cost depends on lifestyle, spending habits, how long retirement actually lasts, and how much prices rise in the meantime. Imagine two entirely different lifestyles. One person living quietly in a small town, growing their own vegetables, driving a paid-off car for 15 years. Another person traveling several times a year, eating out often, living somewhere with a much higher cost of living. Same starting age, same working years, wildly different retirement price tags. That's only part of the story though, because even within a single lifestyle, the number keeps shifting. Why? Because of a force most people underestimate completely. Keep that in mind because we're coming back to it. Let's assume, hypothetically, that your ideal retirement involves owning your home outright, traveling a couple of times a year, and covering everyday costs like groceries, transportation, and healthcare comfortably. Sounds reasonable, right? But here's where things get surprising. Housing alone can vary enormously. A paid-off home in a low-cost area might cost very little to maintain. A home in a high-demand area could carry property taxes and upkeep costs that rival a mortgage payment, even without a mortgage. Transportation is another quiet variable. A quiet retirement might mean one reliable car. A more adventurous retirement might mean frequent flights, road trips, or relocating seasonally. And travel. For some people, retirement means staying close to home. For others, it means finally seeing the places they always meant to visit. Hypothetically, even a modest travel budget of a few $1,000s a year adds up to a significant sum stretched across 2 or 3 decades. This is where the math changes. Because retirement isn't one number. It's a range that depends entirely on the life you're imagining for yourself. And here's what most people miss when they picture retirement. Daily living costs don't disappear just because a paycheck does. Groceries, utilities, insurance, the small recurring expenses that barely register during working years still show up every single month. They just have to be covered from savings instead of income. Hypothetically, even a modest daily routine, coffee out a few times a week, a streaming subscription or two, occasional dinners with family, adds up to thousands of dollars a year that rarely get factored into a rough retirement guess. What most people underestimate isn't any single expense. It's how many small categories are quietly stacking on top of each other at the same time. But even if you nail down your ideal lifestyle perfectly, there's a force working quietly in the background that can undo your entire calculation. And it's the detail almost nobody talks about. Let's use a simple hypothetical example. Say a comfortable lifestyle costs $50,000 a year today. That feels manageable. That feels like a number you could plan around confidently. But what happens 30 years from now? Here's an illustrative calculation. At a modest average inflation rate of just 3% a year, that same $50,000 lifestyle could require well over $120,000 a year 30 years later, just to maintain the exact same standard of living, Not a better lifestyle, the same one. That's the part that catches people off guard. Prices don't need to skyrocket overnight to cause damage. They just need to creep upward, year after year, quietly compounding while nobody's watching closely. This is where many estimates go wrong. People calculate their retirement number using today's prices and forget that retirement might not even begin for another 20 or 30 years. By the time it arrives, the target has already moved. Here's another way to picture it. Imagine setting a savings goal today, then locking that number away and refusing to update it for 3 decades while everything around it, housing, food, utilities, insurance, keeps climbing steadily in the background. That's essentially what happens when someone plans using only today's costs. The number wasn't wrong the day it was written down, it just quietly became outdated with every year that passed. But inflation isn't the only hidden force reshaping this number. There's another one, and it might be even more unpredictable. Healthcare is one of the most underestimated expenses in retirement planning, and it's not hard to see why. When people are younger and healthier, medical costs feel distant and abstract, but retirement often means decades without employer-provided coverage, combined with a stage of life when healthcare needs typically increase. Add rising treatment costs and longer life expectancy, and you get a category of spending that's both large and genuinely hard to predict in advance. Hypothetically, a retired individual might spend a modest amount on routine care in their 60s, only to face significantly higher costs in their 80s as needs increase. Nobody can predict exactly how their health will unfold. That uncertainty itself is part of what makes retirement planning so difficult to pin down with a single number. This is where things get even more interesting because healthcare uncertainty connects directly to a factor that changes everything else on this list. Here's a realization that quietly reshapes everything we've discussed so far. Retirement isn't just about reaching a certain age, it's about how long retirement actually lasts once you get there. What happens when retirement lasts longer than expected? Life expectancy has been increasing for decades. A retirement that once might have lasted 15 years could now realistically stretch to 25 or even 30 years for many people. That's not a small adjustment. That's potentially another decade of expenses layered on top of everything already calculated. Imagine planning carefully for a 20-year retirement, only for that retirement to last 30. Every number discussed earlier, the lifestyle costs, the inflation-adjusted totals, the healthcare estimates, needs to stretch further than originally planned. This single factor alone explains why so many retirement calculators disagree. Some assume shorter retirements, others build in extra years as a buffer. The assumption baked into the calculation quietly determines the final number. So how does all of this actually come together into something usable? Let's walk through a simplified, purely illustrative and educational example. Not advice, not a prediction, just a way to visualize how these pieces connect. Imagine, hypothetically, a retirement lifestyle that requires $60,000 a year in today's dollars. Historically, some planning approaches have used a withdrawal assumption around 4% annually as a rough, simplified starting point for illustration, though this is far from guaranteed and depends heavily on market conditions, timing, and personal circumstances. Using that illustrative framework, $60,000 a year might correspond to a savings target somewhere in the range of $1.5 million in today's dollars. But remember everything we just covered. Adjust that lifestyle cost for inflation over several decades, add healthcare uncertainty, and extend the timeline for a longer than expected retirement, and that number can shift dramatically, sometimes far higher than most people initially assume. This is exactly why the answers people find online vary so widely. Different assumptions about lifestyle, inflation, healthcare, and longevity produce completely different results, even when the underlying math is sound. And this is exactly why simplified rules of thumb, while useful as a starting point, can be dangerously misleading when treated as a final answer. They're a snapshot, not a forecast. A snapshot taken today, applied to a future that hasn't happened yet. So, going back to that number you put in the comments earlier, however close or far it was, you can probably see now why pinning down a single universal figure was never realistic in the first place. Retirement was never really about finding one magic number that applies to everyone. It's about understanding the pieces that quietly shape that number over time. Your lifestyle, your spending patterns, how long your money needs to last, how prices shift over the years, and how much uncertainty naturally exists in a plan that stretches decades into the future. When you look at retirement through that lens, the wildly different numbers you see online suddenly make a lot more sense. They're not contradictions, they're just different assumptions about a life that hasn't been lived yet. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Not a single number to chase, but a clearer way of thinking about the future you're actually building toward. Because once you understand why the numbers differ so much, you stop feeling confused every time you hear a new figure thrown around online. You start recognizing the assumptions hiding underneath it. Is it accounting for inflation over several decades? Is it assuming a short retirement or a long one? Is it factoring in healthcare at all? That single shift in perspective, from chasing a magic number to understanding the moving pieces behind it, is genuinely more valuable than memorizing any figure you'll hear today. Numbers change, the forces that shape them don't. So the next time someone tells you exactly how much you need to retire comfortably, you'll know the real answer. It depends on the life you're planning to live and how carefully you account for the years, the costs, and the uncertainty standing between now and then.